Mr. Bob Steenlang is a 1966 graduate of the United States Military Academy and a Vietnam veteran. He has spoken in over 2,500 schools, universities, corporations, parental meetings, military bases, and prisons, with a very long list of accolades. Bob is a man of great faith, integrity, determination, compassion, and wisdom. His powerful story will uplift and inspire you as he shares lessons in life he learned while growing up in a dysfunctional family in Britt, Iowa, to becoming Iowa's first 4-time state wrestling champion, then going on to graduate from West Point, Airborne, and Ranger School. Bob shares his thoughts and perspective on his 1968 tour of duty in Vietnam, raising his family of 8 with his wife Bobby, reconciliation with his past, living with PTSD, and his return to Vietnam in January 2018 with 4 of their sons. His story of courage and inspiration is one you won't want to miss.
I'm going to start by showing some slides from a trip to Vietnam that I took on the 50th anniversary of being in Vietnam. I was in the Signal Corps with the 4th Infantry Division in 1968, and I chose Signal Corps because I wasn't anxious to be in the infantry. But the Tet Offensive happened, and we were required to go on patrols, not as much as the infantry, but things changed pretty dramatically. So I'm just going to tell my story from going to Vietnam briefly here, and then I'll get into the meat and potatoes. We have 8 children, 5 boys and 3 girls, and our son Keith asked if I would want to go to Vietnam as a visit, and I debated it for a long time, and suddenly it came to me that that might be good for me after talking to different ones that have gone. And the 5 boys were going to go with me, but 3 of the boys own a construction business, Anchor Builders, in the Minneapolis area, and so one of them couldn't go, so the 4 of our 5 sons went. This is my dad when he came back from World War II. I was born on February 28, 1944, just missed leap year, the 29th. And my dad was on a ship to Italy and was wounded in Italy and came back a changed person. The whole time I grew up as a child, no one told me that my dad was the way he was because of the war. And so we didn't have a very good relationship. The ironic thing, 23 years later, I come home from Vietnam and have my son. And we had our challenges because of my PTSD. Bobby and I, after I got back, and our son Eric, when I first was assigned to the 4th Infantry Division, was on the 15th of December, 1967, and my first duty was to set up the communication for Bob Hope Show. And so I thought, man, this isn't bad at all. and then on January 1st, things changed dramatically, and I got sent to the field, and bad things started to happen. On patrol, this is when we arrived in Vietnam 50 years later. We went through Hanoi, and every one of the children went through customs like no problem at all. They stopped me immediately as I went to the counter there. They went through the papers, passport over and over again, had me go sit down, brought a whole bunch of officials in. The children are sitting on the other side of the fence, so to speak, wondering what's going on. And after a long time, finally they motioned me through. So I don't know what they were checking, but it was pretty scary for the family. This is when we finally got through. Our guide in Hanoi. This is Ho Chi Minh's office. It was exactly like it was before. There's near his office, Buddhist temple, Hanoi Hilton. And then this was, we all know about Hanoi Hilton, one way or another. I don't know if you can read that. A lot of propaganda. This was during the French War, and they showed us the shackles. These are actually dummies. And the Vietnamese at that time shackled their prisoners to the floor at an angle like that with the head down here. So the feet were high, the head was low. And a lot of stories about the torture. Jane Fonda. I'm not going to talk too much about this because it's awful easy to get worked up. I had a friend that was there when she came, and the things he tells about her and what she did are something we all know about. Pretty miserable. But there we are in rickshaws. We each had our own. Going around Hanoi, our first meal in Vietnam. Some of the statues there. Looking out the hotel window. For some reason, the buildings only allowed a small space, and so everything just went high in order to get more rooms. They are going on one of the rivers. Now this is quite interesting. We're going through water went through like a cave, and they never said anything about being careful. And so I'm taking pictures and so forth, and all of a sudden, somebody hit the back of my head just like that. And there was a lady behind me, and if she hadn't pushed me down, I would have got it right in the forehead. And we were going probably 20 miles an hour in the boat. And that's the lady, and we're still in communication today. They're from England. So otherwise, I would have had a short trip. Some of the meals, the fish, on the river again. Some of the Vietnamese children. Another one of our guides. Some of the Vietnamese. This was in 2008, January of 2018. We traveled down to Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City. They were going into a big cave. That man right there, he fought on the side of the South during the Vietnam War. So we had a lot to talk about. Da Nang. John had never been in the ocean before. South China Sea, known as China Beach. This is one of our guides, and she was always talking. She can talk good English, and somebody asked her, "Why do you talk sometimes?" She said, I have an itchy tongue. So she was always talking, just real bubbly. I was 74 at the time. I'm 78 now. And that Vietnamese lady is her organic garden, and she was the same age as I was. Some of her things from the garden. Right there was like a cane and a stool. And I got hit by a tree in '85. Wasn't expected to live, wasn't expected to walk, and so my pelvis gets very tired, and if I got tired, I would just sit down on my stool. It's kind of interesting. They put me on this water buffalo. Pretty meaningful at the time, comparing 50 years. Organic garden. On the river. They took us all on private rides. This particular man took me, that lady that I told you about, Lily, her father fought as a Viet Cong in the river for I think like 10 years and breathed through a reed. And I think I got a picture of him. But anyway, he took me to where that man fought against the Americans. It was pretty interesting. Meal of fish on the boat. Some of us tried chopsticks. They're always trying to sell something, and that white shirt. There's two of our guides, and we actually convinced them to go out to a restaurant. This right here is a picture of that Viet Cong, and he had passed away, and they keep a picture of him because of the religion in their house. This is another man that I met that fought. We talked a little bit, and all of a sudden, somebody said, "Psh, psh," there's somebody watching you. You got to be careful what you're saying. So even though we didn't notice it so much in the South, it's a communist nation. We had to be careful what we're going to say. Now this is kind of interesting. His son put his father on his back and carried him on the plane because he couldn't walk very well. So I asked my children if they were going to do the same, and they politely declined. I weighed a lot more, over 200 at that time. There we are on the plane, going to Pleiku, 4th Infantry Division. Dak To sign. I served at the Pleiku area, Oasis, Kontum, Dak To, in those areas. Here's the airstrip that we flew into Dak To. A lot of bad things going on at that time, and the fall of '67 and the Tet of spring of '68. That's the airstrip I landed on, 10 miles from Cambodia. There's our guide. Eric, my oldest son, was born when I was in Vietnam in 1968. Bobby almost died of childbirth because when she was pregnant, she didn't know she was pregnant. She went to the doctor and had a cold over at Fort Hood, Texas, and the doctor gave her a drug, and it caused medical problems for our son. He was born with a cleft lip, cleft palate. His head was much larger than it's supposed to be. The skull was completely growing together, didn't collapse in the birth canal, and Bobby almost passed away. And then Eric had to have all kinds of surgeries all the way to adulthood. Anyway, it inspired him to be a doctor. He's an orthopedic surgeon right now, mainly because of what happened there. Being there and seeing all these signs, it was very emotional. The Trang Valley, and this is where they made the movie. We were soldiers, and that's where the battle actually took place. I still stay in contact with our guide. Here was a battlefield, and we found all kinds of relics. You can see them sitting on my chair there. That's some of them. We got some of them out of the country. Campanari, 4th Infantry Division. And we were there. They brought up on their cell phones what it looked like in 1968, the same exact spot. Farmer's house. There's a man and his family, one of our guides. Still staying in contact with him. This is in National Geographic article from 1968. I happened to have that magazine, or somebody gave it to me. We were in a hotel looking down on some of the construction. They do most of it by hand, men and women working together. Leaving Pleiku, the government owns all the airplanes. There was a Vietnamese showing an underground tunnel, and one of our sons, Keith, went down in there, closed it up, and then he's coming out. Underground tunnels, and some of our children went down there, but I got claustrophobia, so I didn't go down. Some of the punji sticks, put grass and sticks over it, and then you fall in. That's some of the dress of the day. There were mannequins. Museum of some of the military equipment they had gotten from the Americans. A sign on the street of Ho Chi Minh. One of our guides. We're on the river. One thing was interesting, they a lot of motorbikes, and they put all kinds of things in there. Even we saw calves on there and all kinds of animals and plants and so forth. There's a candy factory, doing it by hand. A fish, this is the way they served it. Just finished a meal. We were on a boat and we stopped to eat there. Half peeled off fruit, I can't remember what it was called. They were drinking out of a coconut. Bananas. Fruit market. One of our guides. This is in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, January 16th of 2018. We went to Ho Chi Minh City. It's a restaurants of all types, and more of a modern city. So we like, I think it was Indian food that we liked so well. So we went to this big restaurant, And then all of a sudden, two of our sons, Eric and Keith, jumped up and ran over and hugged this couple. And here is somebody they knew from somewhere and lived in the same area, in the Atlanta area. And they were over there, were American business or Vietnamese business, and we met in Ho Chi Minh City, so it was pretty exciting. Leaving after 2 weeks, Tet Offensive, some of the things I brought back for Bai, some of the goodies. Bobby and I have been married 56 happy years, and she appreciates the gifts. Anybody have any questions?
Did you feel like you healed from being there, or it helped you?
Yes, that's a very good question. I should have covered that. I didn't want to go for a long time, and then it just came to me, I think it might be good. But the thing that really helped me, Mary, with the healing, because I'm a compassionate person, and I felt guilty for a lot of reasons. You know, why am I alive and somebody else isn't? I lost 1 out of 20 of my West Point classmates killed, 1 out of every 6 wounded and maimed. And then, but I felt sorry for the Vietnamese as a nation, all the suffering that took place. And so I got to talk to 3 families who had a relative that fought against the Americans. And every one of them said, we had nothing against the American soldier. It was our government and the American government. Our government was wrong. And Russia pushed us. And then China, they hated China for pushing them in the war. And later, sometimes after we left, they fought against China and won that skirmish. But they all said we have nothing about the Americans, against the American soldier, the families told me. They said if we could meet on the street today, we would be good friends. And I became friends with some of the family members. So that took away a lot of my anxiety and guilt. And to see also, even though they were a communist nation, they were flourishing economically. They could look on the internet and find out what the truth was, what was going on in the world. And so it was good for them as a family and good for me. Does that make sense? It just made my life a lot easier after 50 years. Yes, sir.
When you arrived at the airport, you said you were segregated from your sons. Do you think that they kind of screen possible Vietnam vets before they go into the country?
I think so. We debated it and we tried to find out. We never did. But I'm sure my age, my name came up someplace. I was there a whole year. They probably have something on the computer. They checked me out thoroughly. I'm sure it had something to the fact that I had been there. Yeah. But the whole thing was kind of scary because, you know, I didn't know the communist nation whether they're just going to pick me up and throw me in a cell someplace. And of course the children are on the other side, big eyes wondering what's happening, you know. But Hanoi was much stricter than the rest of Vietnam as far as what you could do or not do. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Do you think it brought it closer to your family a little bit, going through that with them?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, sir. We became a lot closer because when I grew up, I didn't know my dad had PTSD. And no one told me. It would have made all the difference in the world. Because I never knew my dad before the war, of course. I was born when he was on the way over there. And so my dad became an alcoholic and ran a bar. We had no relationship. Eventually I had 2 younger brothers and sisters who treated them different than myself. And it just would have been a lot better if I had known, because after my dad died in 1973, when he was only 55 years old, he had a heart attack in his bar. Then I found out from people that came up to me, they said, if you only knew your dad before he went to the war, totally different, totally different. And when this book was written in 1973, I was very bitter. 1993, I was very bitter against my dad. And later on, as I found out about my dad, then I put this at the bottom here. The book written in 1993 when I was 49 contains great bitterness towards my dad. By 1996, 8:52, a healing had begun in my heart. And now, 2017, age 72, I am overflowing with thankfulness that our Creator gave me the father I had. It set the stage for forgiveness, peace, rest, love, and success in my life. And so I wish, like many of us, I'm sure, that we could have spent time with our parents and they had lived longer and so forth. But it's taught me some lessons because I had PTSD and I had not a good relationship with some of our older children, which is still healing. But what I'm trying to do is be open with my children and so they can ask questions and so forth. Yes, sir.
When your kids were growing up, were younger, did you talk to them about Vietnam much, or did that only happen later?
It all happened later, and I'll just tell this part of what I'll be talking about a little later. Bobby and I never talked about Vietnam, and we were very close as a couple. And I could never figure out why she would never ask about Vietnam, never. And I never asked her why, because, it's just taboo. Well, I got hit by a tree in '85, almost killed on a farm, and was recommended by the VA that I try to get a farm. As I was in Redwood Falls, Minnesota as a teacher and a businessman at the time. So I went to Winona, Minnesota to a realtor and looked at farms, and we bought our farm that we're at in 1977, just 7 miles south of Arcadia, on Highway 93. If you're ever in the area, just stop by. We're just a block off the main road, big pole barn, weeping willow trees and so forth. So anyway, that's where we ended up. And I got hit by a tree and tried to get a teaching job, and got a teaching job in science and math at Gilmanton, a little town by Mondovi, Wisconsin. And kids found out that I was a Vietnam vet, and this is 1985. So by that time, a lot of people want to know about Vietnam. So I finally gave in to their request to talk about it, and because I didn't talk about it to anybody, and so they videotaped it. And that very day, Bobby, one of those coincidences in life, got called to substitute school at Gilmanton by Mondovi. And at the same day I gave the talk, she heard the talk. And on the way home, for the first time, I asked her why she never asked about Vietnam. And she said it's very simple. When we left Fort Sheridan in 1970, after I got back from Vietnam, the consul had us in and said, whatever you do, do not talk about Vietnam unless he brings it up. Well, I'm sure there's some truth to that, but I never brought it up. She never brought it up. So that was a big opening for Bobby and I to communicate on Vietnam and the things that happened and the hurts. And also what happened out of that is that videotape started to get passed around to other schools. And pretty soon I started getting calls. Could you come and talk? Not just in Vietnam, but overcoming obstacles and how to think and how are you handling your PTSD and all these things. And they said we need funding. So we're going to pay for it through the drug and alcohol funding they had at that time. And they said, were you ever a drinker or alcoholic? No, but my dad was. They said, that's it. So I started out small in schools. Within 2 or 3 years, I was traveling all over the eastern part of the United States, Far west is Colorado, giving talks in schools and corporations, prisons, and colleges, and had some wonderful experiences. And it's really ironic because I almost flunked out of West Point 4 times, twice in English because I couldn't stand up and give a talk to 17 classmates or write a proper paragraph. And then later on, all this happened, and it'll all tie together as I talk about some of the things I'm going to be talking about. Somebody else had a question. Yes, sir.
I heard you talk a couple of years ago when you talked about graduating from West Point, and you talked about the keynote speaker that was there at that time. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, actually what happened, I got a call from, not a call, but when I was a junior in high school, I was a wrestler in high school, and in Iowa. And I got a letter from the wrestling coach at West Point, who happened to be from near Mason City, Iowa, only 30 miles from where I was. And he asked me if I would consider trying to get into West Point. And I'm telling you the truth. I didn't even, had never even heard of the place. Did nothing about it. I was in a survival mode for a lot of reasons. Well, I'll tell you about it, never heard about it. And anyway, I took the test and got in. And then, before I went there, I graduated in May of 1962. And it so happened there was somebody from Iowa that was graduating from West Point in June of 62. And the coach asked me if I wanted to come out for the graduation before I got inducted at West Point in July. So I went out there, and President John F. Kennedy was the speaker. And had a big effect on my life. You had a question, you raised your hand, and I always bypass you.
Yes, sir. You said you're on a boat with your family and boys on the way to the cruise or something. Some lady bumped the back of your head and it hit her head. I missed
But what happened, we're on a boat, small boat, well, not real small, and we're going through a cave. And there's rocks, whatever they call them, sticking down. And I looked ahead and looked like nobody's ducking or anything. So I'm taking pictures and so forth. And all of a sudden, a lady, I found out it was a lady, hit the back of my head, pushed my head down, and I had just missed a rock that was going to hit me right in the forehead. We're going 20 miles an hour in the boat, so we're traveling along, and boom, could have got knocked out, killed, or missed the rest of it, but that's what happened. She pushed my head down. And she didn't think about it or anything. She just, boom, pushed my head down, and we became close friends and communicate today. Is that what you meant?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, Mary?
I know that when you went to West Point, you were not expecting to go to Vietnam. How was that presented to the graduating class, or how did you all know that this was something you were going to do?
Well, I asked Coach Alitz, the coach at West Point, are we going to get in a war? If I read history a little bit, sure we are. If we can't be in a legitimate war, we'll make one up and send you over there. So anyway, he was a sincere man, and he said he did not know of anything in 1961 or 62 regarding a commitment, so forth. And during that time at West Point, at 63, my sophomore year, I think President Kennedy was killed. President Johnson came in, and I've studied this and documented it, that President Kennedy got us involved in Vietnam in a small way, but through the influence of his brother and others, he was going to get us out of Vietnam. He was not going to expand. It's documented. As soon as President Johnson became president, he completely changed that. And, almost all of us, we had to go to Airborne Ranger School, and we all ended up in Vietnam. And I was fortunate I didn't have to go back a second or third time. None of our children went in the military. I didn't tell them not to. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
When you were
50 years.
Did you actually eat that Vietnamese food?
All the time. But then, it was not like when we were over there before. They had restaurants and everything was checked out and everything. So we ate a lot of Vietnamese food and had no problem. But they told us where to go and where not to go.
Okay.
Good. Any other questions? Okay. I got about 25 minutes, and I have some things I'm going to share from my heart with you as Vietnam veterans and families and wives. It has to do with thoughts. Attitude. Everything is dependent on that. How we survive, how we endure, how we take the nightmares, how we take the harassment from people that make fun of you. Or I just had an incident happen, I don't even want to go into it, it would upset me so much. It's amazing how some people can have no feeling. You know, this man was a friend and stopped by, and usually he talks about the grandchildren and so forth, and he wanted to talk politics. And I said, I don't want to talk politics. And he went on and on. Pretty soon I'm screaming at him. I'm so upset. And I told him, don't you know what you're doing? Why, I'm asking you, I'm begging you to stop talking about it or just leave. And he didn't. And finally, he didn't understand. And finally, he left. And it's just amazing that these things can happen. And you know when something like this happens, why are people doing that? Why can't they have any compassion and upset you? And it has to do, the only way to survive it is to get control of our thoughts. Because for most of us, our thoughts are like a feather in the wind. Blows, we don't have any control. But I learned, and I'm going to tell that briefly, how I learned how to control my thoughts, which keeps me sane. At that incident 3 weeks ago, anything could have happened. I was so upset. Attitude by Charles Swindoll. The longer I live, the more I realize the impact of attitude on life. Attitude to me is more important than facts. It is more important than the past, than education, than money, than circumstances, than failures, than successes, than what other people think or say or do. It is more important than the appearance, giftedness, or skill. It will make or break a company, a church, a home. The remarkable thing is we have a choice every day regarding the attitude we will embrace for that day. We cannot change our past. We cannot change the fact that people will act in a certain way, like that man did. We cannot change the inevitable. The only thing we can do is play the one string we have, and that is our attitude. I am convinced that life is 10% what happens to me and 90% of how I react to it. And so it is with you and with us as veterans. We all are in charge of our attitude. And how this all came about was back in 7th grade. In one of the books it said that you can't change your personality, you can't change your thoughts of who you are. And I just didn't believe that. And then I had a couple things that happened to me. One of them was I had a dream about the time I was in 7th grade. And I was very slow in school. I was in the worst reading group. I couldn't answer questions in class, and everybody was raising their hands, and I couldn't figure out why I was so slow. And then I had a dream. I won't go into all the details to save some time, but in this dream, 3 things came across. Number 1, most people are lazy. Outwork them. Doesn't make a difference if you're in the worst reading group. Just work harder than everybody else. And it just wasn't just a little minor thought. It was just like, it was just engrooved in me forever. I'm going to work harder than everybody else. And the thing that it really made a difference too from this dream is that I wanted my father to love me, and I was willing to do anything. They say in psychology books that many times if you want somebody to love you like your father, many times you do something really bad, getting drugs and whatever, then they might pay attention to you. Fortunately, I got into sports, and I thought if I could win one more wrestling match, maybe my dad would love me. So in that dream, it had such an effect because I was driven like a crazy man to get my dad to love me. The second part of that dream is that you should be kind to people. Not just here and there, but kind to everyone at all times, to the nth degree. And be thankful for everything. Be thankful for everything that comes along. And I'm going to give an example because that was the hardest one. Why can you be thankful? Why should I be thankful? Because I forgot my dentures this morning. But you'll understand before I finish here why we need to give thankfulness for everything, because it helps to keep us sane. I learned it had such an effect because I was driven to please my father that I became obsessed with doing this, being kind to people, being thankful for everything. And then I realized something, that the more I did it, the more peace I had, the more friends I had, the more success I had. I had strange thoughts as a ninth grader. I want to be a state champion as a ninth grader. You don't think that as a ninth grader. Most ninth graders out for wrestling, you're doing well if you make the wrestling team on the varsity or B squad. I'm thinking about becoming a state champion. Where did that come from? It came from kindness and being thankful. I know it, and I've lived it. I'm now 78 years old, and that changed my whole life around. If I can be state champion one time, why not 4 times? And when that happens, strange things happen. Like all of a sudden, I'm in Iowa, in a small town. We just got a TV, didn't even know what West Point was. But all of a sudden, when you are thankful and kind to other people, it's just like you get lifted up and put on another level in life. I didn't even know about West Point, and in 1961, a year and a half later, I'm sitting at West Point in the audience listening to President Kennedy. It just happens. Unbelievable things happen. I compare it to gravity. Gravity on Earth is 9.8 meters per second squared. Gravity on the moon is 1.62 meters per second squared. If we were long jumpers, high jumper, pole vaulter, if we had to fight against gravity of the moon, we'd be a star. But that's what it's like when you're kind to people and you're thankful. It's like you have obstacles, but somehow you make it through over and over and over again. When I had to go for the test for West Point, I think it was Fort Leonard Wood, it was the Monday after the state tournament, my senior year, 1962. It was 20 below zero, and got down there, and I thought it was just a physical, the academic part to take tests to get into West Point. And that was scary because I was a class of 49 students, but it wasn't, I was 4th from the top in high school, but it wasn't because I was smart. I just outworked everybody else. Now I've got to take these tests into West Point. So anyway, when I got down there, I took these tests, and then they say you have to do push-ups and pull-ups. Well, in the state tournament, I wrestled in the finals with a separated shoulder from the semifinals. Didn't know it till Sunday morning. Now it's Monday, and I'm supposed to do push-ups and pull-ups. Because you're kind, because you're thankful. What did your mind do? Life isn't fair. Why didn't they tell me? No, you don't think that way most of the time. All of a sudden, I'll try One-handed push-ups with my right shoulder. I never did a one-handed push-up before or since. I got down and did whatever was 15 or 20 left-handed push-ups. Then you had to do pull-ups. Oh, how you gonna do pull-ups? Jump up in the bar. Of course, I was in shape. I wasn't overweight. It was after the wrestling season, and I did the required number of pull-ups. Things just began to change. I can give you example after example of how things changed after that. One of the things that just happened recently is I wanted to get some weed whipping done before it snowed. And my weed whip, after all these years, broke. So one of our children, our third child, Sarah, is a veterinarian in the area, and called her husband and borrowed their weed whip. Well, the weed whip, the first thing that happened, the battery ran out, so we had to get it charged. And then the string ran out, and I'm not familiar with it. So Bobby and I are putting this string in there, and it still didn't work, and I took it out outside to put it in, and it was getting cold, it was snow, and I wanted to get done. I'm trying to be thankful for the snow and so forth. So I take it back to the house and get back to the house, and here I lost the spring. How am I going to weed whip? How am I going to explain to my son-in-law? What am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to be thankful. I'm not thankful. My conscience says try to be thankful. You know, on the third time walking from the gator, our gator where I was at with the weed whip, scraping the snow with a rake, I kept saying, I'm going to be thankful, I'm going to be thankful, I'm going to be thankful. And there was that spring laying on the ground. 2 months ago, I lost one of my hearing aids. Couldn't find any place. I didn't want to go back to VA and try to explain to them how I lost my hearing aid. And I'm just feeling horrible. And Bobby said, well, why don't you say you're thankful for losing your hearing aid? Well, I'm not really thankful. Well, do it anyway, because the universe seems to honor it when you're thankful, or you try to be thankful. So I said I'm thankful for losing my hearing aid. I took one step, and Bobby said, you won't believe what I found in the sink. In the rack, there was some food or something there that she was going to push down the fire extinguisher, down the garbage disposal, and there was my hearing aid. She was just about ready to push it down the garbage disposal. And we found it after. I said, I'm thankful. Even though I really wasn't. But discipline does something, and the universe honors it. A lot of times you get peace, a lot of times you get solution. It varies, and everything's not dramatic. So I'm just sharing with you some of the more dramatic ones. One time, I was out speaking, and I had to go down to North Carolina or someplace like that, and I had to go through Atlanta, and had to change planes. Well, we got bumped. 5 of us. 5 of us got bumped. 2 of them were engineers, top secret engineers that had to get to some corporation because attached to the government, they had to get there, and there was no plane to get there for another hour or so, or 2 hours. One lady was swearing a blue streak. This one man took his suitcase, swung it over on the ground, clothes all over the place. The police were called, and then there's me. I'm just as upset as they are. And then I got thinking, what did I learn? I'm going to be thankful. Well, I'm not thankful. I'm going to try to be thankful, and I say it out loud to myself. I am thankful. I'm getting bumped. It's not the end of the world. I'm thankful. Pretty soon, I don't feel so bad. Pretty soon, it's not the end of the world. Pretty soon, I'm smiling. Pretty soon, the people behind the counter are smiling back at me. And within, within 10 minutes, they called me up there and said, Mr. Steenlang, come to the counter. And they said, I tried to tell it exactly like they said. They said, we have called a plane in that's on the runway. They never do that. They called the plane back because there's one seat. And they called the plane back. One man came, picked up my suitcase, went me through this back door, took me down this back hallway, put me on the next plane, and everybody is saying, who's the VIP? Who's the VIP? Things like that happen. I can remember one time I was giving a talk in New York City, and somebody was supposed to pick me up at 9 o'clock to take me to another state where I was supposed to give another talk. And it was 11 o'clock at night, and it kept coming to me. It kept coming to me. You got to get out of here earlier. You got to call the man at 11 o'clock and tell him you want to be picked up at 7 o'clock. No, I don't want to do it. Don't want to do it. But if you ever have a conflict between what your mind is telling, your heart is telling you, follow your heart. So I finally called the man. He came. He was willing, wasn't too upset, picked me up. So we leave New York City at 7 o'clock in the morning. We're driving out of the city, and all of a sudden, every light behind us is flashing. Red, red, off and on, red. It was in the summer. There was a heat wave going on, all the air conditioners and so forth. All the electricity went off in New York City. If we had not got out of there at 7 o'clock, we hit the last light, we never would have made it. I'm so thankful for you inviting me here. It means a lot to be with fellow veterans and their families, because we're a unit. Nobody can know how we feel, what we go through. But Vietnam to me was one of the worst things that happened, but now it's one of the best things that happened. If it wasn't for Vietnam, I wouldn't be standing up here sharing these things. I wouldn't have the peace and rest that I have. I wouldn't have learned about how to think, the importance of being thankful, the importance of being kind. It changes everything. But a person has to discipline themselves. And there'll be plenty of people that will find fault with what I'm sharing, but it works. It works over and over again. The very least you'll get is more peace. And so a person needs to write down every single day. If you miss a day, it's not the end of the world. 10 reasons why you're thankful. Usually it's the same 10 reasons, but you need to write it down. Get a book and write down 10 reasons every day, and like in the morning, that you're thankful for, and review them. It makes a difference. Well, some people say, excuse me, I'm just going to think about it. No, you got to write it down. The very act of writing it down makes a difference. We got to remember that life is not fair. The quote I gave before, I am convinced that life is 10% what happens to me and 90% of how I react to it. Albert Schweitzer said once, "One thing I know, the only ones among you who will be really happy are those who will have sought and found how to serve." How to serve. How to give. How to serve. Being kind is serving, helping, being thankful. We're not in charge of the universe. We're not going to talk about religion. All I know is that in the universe, when you follow certain laws, like gravity on the moon or gravity on the earth, they work. Successful people are always looking for opportunities to help others. Unsuccessful people always ask, what is in it for me? Brian Tracy. What's in it for me? What's in it for me? I remember growing up, before I learned this, I used to be jealous of people that could read better than I could, that were better in sports. That all disappeared. I'm happy for them. When somebody else is successful, you're happy for them. Can you imagine how much more peace we have when you're happy for somebody else's success? Excuse me, instead of being jealous? Excuse me. I became thankful for my dad. As I said before, he died at age 55. We never had peace. But now, my whole heart has changed toward him. And I talk to people that knew him and what he was like before the war. And the cover of the book has said, this book, as I read before, written in 1993, contains great bitterness towards my dad. By 1996, a healing had begun in my heart. Now I am overflowing with thankfulness that our Creator gave me the father I had. It set the stage for forgiveness, peace, rest, love, and success in my life. I wouldn't have ever had any success in my life if my dad had not been the way he was. Gratitude unlocks the fullness of life. It turns what we have into enough and more. It turns denial into acceptance, chaos to order, confusion to clarity. It can turn a meal into a feast, a house into a home, a stranger into a friend. Gratitude makes sense of our past, brings peace for today, creates a vision for tomorrow. We cannot be grateful and still be bitter. We cannot be grateful and be unhappy. We cannot be grateful and be without hope. We cannot be grateful and be unloving. So learn how to be grateful and kind as if your life depended on it, because it does. Thank you very much. Does anybody else have any questions?
There are so many young people today that don't have any direction in life. They come up with a lot of excuses why they can't do something, or why they don't join this group, or why they don't do that. What do you suggest you talk to them about? But the younger people just don't get it.
Well, one thing we can do is start by, and you're right, I go through the same thing that most of us our age do. First thing we do, excuse me, is give thanks for where we grew up, when we grew up, and what country we grew up in. Because we're blessed. Of all the people in the world that have been born in the United States, in the Midwest, rural area, and so forth. For some reason, and I'm not going to get into politics, for some reason, somebody, or some force is trying to change our culture. That's it. It's more successful than war. The way, if somebody wants to defeat a country like the United States, you change their culture. Just like Paul Harvey said many, many years ago. And he was mild. If you change this, you change this, you change this. You get somebody to ask when you're in elementary school, do you want to be a little boy or a little girl? You start changing thoughts. You start taking away the idea that hard work is of value. And share everything like dictators in communist countries do. Well, in my opinion, that's what's happening to the United States. It's been going on for 30-some years, and little by little they're succeeding in changing attitudes. You know, I don't have to work and somebody owes me something. So I don't know what the solution is, but first of all, we've got to realize that there's an actual happening, and somebody is behind it. For whatever reason. Money, power, but it's destroying, in my opinion, our country, and the poor youth have to suffer all these things. So the first thing we have to do is keep our sanity and be thankful for when we grew up. And what we can say to people and to the youth is to open our hearts, because most of us wear a little mask, an artificial mask. That's just the way it is. We don't want people to really know when we're inside. But if you take off that mask and open your heart and you say, this is who I am, and I'm thankful that I am where I am, but this is what's happening to you. Somebody is trying to change your attitude, and the more you do, the more miserable you are. This is what's going to make you happy. Get a job and work hard. Don't expect somebody to give you something for nothing. And just talk from your heart and say, I know it's not easy, and I don't know what I would do if I was in your shoes. But if you open your heart and talk to them and be a listener. Most people are not good listeners. I remember one time somebody called me up with this problem and talked for 15 minutes, and all I did was say yes, At the end of the phone call, he said, thank you so much for the great advice. I didn't give him any advice. I just listened. So there's no perfect solution, and that's an excellent question, because people of our age, you know, like our children, all 8 of our children grew up on the farm, so they know how to work. And that makes them different from a lot of people their age, you know. And so all we can do is open our heart and just share our strengths and weaknesses and just say, let's talk again and think about what we said. And we might reach one person once in a while. That makes sense at all? Thank you very much.